Welcome to Shadow Fable. If you enjoy stories that linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, be sure to subscribe and follow for more. The first time it happened, Madeline chalked it up to coincidence. The woman had been pleasant enough, elderly, kind. She sat for Madeline 3 afternoons in a row, sipping lukewarm tea, her skin papery and translucent in the warm studio light. She spoke of her late husband, her love of lilacs, and how her children never visited anymore. Madeline had captured every crinkle in her smile, every weary sag in her shoulders. The portrait was, by all accounts, beautiful. But when she returned to the nursing home 2 weeks later to deliver the finished piece, the room was empty. The nurse at the desk furrowed her brow and checked the file twice. "There's no record of her here," she said. Madeline blinked. "What do you mean? I was just here, room 214. The nurse offered an apologetic shrug. "That room's been vacant for months." Madeline left the facility with the painting wrapped carefully under her arm and a tight knot forming in her chest. That night, she stared at it, propped against the far wall of her studio. The woman's eyes looked a little more hollow than she remembered. Had they always been like that? She didn't paint for a week after that, but time, as it always does, dulled the unease. She told herself it was a clerical error. Maybe the woman had given her a false name. Maybe she'd been moved, discharged, or worse, but surely not erased. People don't just vanish. Still, the second time it happened, denial was harder to muster. Julian Torres was a jazz musician with soft hands and deep laugh lines. He brought his trumpet to the sessions, often playing between breaks while Madeline worked. There was a rhythm to him, a warmth that made her studio feel less cold. He spoke about gigs in smoky basements and his wife, gone 10 years now, whose memory lived in every note he played. The painting came out well. No, it was stunning. His posture was relaxed, eyes half-lidded as though mid-note, lips just brushing the brass. She was proud of it. Proud, and then confused, then alarmed. She sent a message to his email, asking for an address to send the final piece. No reply. She tried again, then called the number he'd written on the back of her sketchbook. "This number is not in service." She searched online. Nothing. No obituary, no social media, no articles, no mentions. It was as if he'd never existed. The music venue he'd mentioned downtown, closed 5 years ago. The bar where he met his wife, torn down. She stood in front of the painting at midnight, studying it like a stranger. Julian's eyes stared out at her, softer now, maybe sadder. The trumpet in his hands gleamed, but his body seemed a little faded. Not in the pigment, in presence. As though he were disappearing from more than just the world. Madeline didn't sleep that night. She stopped painting portraits for a while, took on landscapes instead, still lifes, safe, inanimate things that couldn't vanish. But the calls kept coming. Friends of friends, acquaintances. A woman from her gym who'd seen her work online. People requesting portraits, drawn to her capturing of the essence. That's what they all said. She needed the money. The commissions kept her afloat. And she couldn't help it. There was a part of her that wanted to try again. Maybe it was all coincidence. Then came Camille, young, vibrant, a little strange. She showed up to her first session with a bouquet of wilted daisies and a notebook full of poems about dying stars and lost twins. She told Madeline she'd always wanted to be immortalized in paint. "I don't want a selfie," she said. "I want to exist." Madeline felt a chill at that, but she nodded and painted. Camille returned 3 times, each session marked by quiet intensity. She stared directly into Madeline's eyes for long stretches, unblinking, almost daring her to see something deeper. Her presence lingered long after she left. The finished painting was haunting. Camille, seated by the window, shadows falling across her face, the daisies in a jar on the sill behind her, browned at the edges. Madeline called her number the next morning, disconnected. She tried Instagram, gone, no trace. Madeline felt her breath catch in her throat. She ran to her studio, nearly knocking over the easel. She stared at the painting, now fully dried. Camille's face looked altered, the mouth slightly parted as if to speak, the eyes glassy, vacant. Madeline turned the canvas to the wall and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing. Then tap. She spun around, no one. Tap again. The sound was coming from inside the walls, behind the canvas. That was ridiculous. She didn't sleep that night either. She considered throwing the painting out. But something inside her resisted. Some thread, invisible but taut, held her back. Instead, she locked the studio and tried to ignore the ever-growing collection of finished portraits, each one depicting someone who, as far as she could tell, no longer existed in any record. She went to the police once, clutching the portrait of Julian in her arms like a shield. "I think something's happened to my subjects," she told the officer. "They're gone. I've looked everywhere. They're just gone." He took the report, nodded, told her to get some rest. The file, she suspected, was never opened. A few nights later, she heard footsteps in the studio. Not creaks, not house-settling noises. Footsteps. She grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, calling out in a voice far braver than she felt. Nothing answered. But when she opened the door, the smell hit her. Turpentine and something else. Damp, earthy, decay. The portraits were all facing forward again. All of them. Julian, Camille, the old woman. Others she didn't remember painting. The room seemed fuller. She stood frozen, breath shallow. A canvas in the corner shifted, not fell. Shifted, like someone had pushed it. She slammed the door and ran. That night she dreamed of the corridor behind her studio wall, lined with frames and whispering mouths. A hallway of faces, familiar yet wrong. All watching, waiting. She awoke to find a smear of oil paint on her bedsheet, and a sketch she didn't remember drawing on her desk. A man's face, blank eyes. Her hand still smelled like linseed. She hadn't painted in her sleep since art school. Madeline stopped accepting commissions, stopped answering her phone. She covered the mirrors in her apartment and unplugged her Wi-Fi. She left her food to rot and let the light bulbs burn out one by one. Still, they came. In dreams, in the corners of her vision, in faint hums of static behind the silence. The paintings, she began to suspect, were not capturing the subjects. They were keeping them. She tried burning one, Camille's. She carried it to the alley behind her building, soaked it in lighter fluid, and lit a match. The fire roared, high and angry, and then died. The canvas lay in the ash, untouched, not even scorched. When she picked it up, Camille's face was turned slightly to the side, smiling. That was not how she painted it. Madeline screamed, or thought she did. No sound came out. She dropped the canvas and ran. She didn't return home that night, or the next. She stayed in a hotel across town, pacing the floor, biting her nails until they bled. The TV played static. Her phone refused to turn on. The lights flickered even when the power was off. She looked in the bathroom mirror and saw someone else's expression. Madeline took a deep breath and decided to destroy the studio, She'd tear the canvases apart, rip the fabric, smash the frames. She didn't care if it was madness. Whatever this was, it had to end. She returned just before dawn. The street was silent. Her key turned in the lock with a soft click. Inside, the air was thick, like walking into a church after midnight. Sacred, wrong. She flipped the light. The studio was empty. No canvases, no easels, no brushes, just walls, bare, white, pristine, and in the center of the room, an unfinished canvas. Blank. Fresh. Waiting. Madeline stood before it, heart hammering. And then, slowly, almost gently, her hand reached for the brush. Her fingers closed around the handle like it had always belonged to her, as if there was no other choice. The bristles were clean, the paint on the nearby palette untouched, each color arranged in perfect little mounds: ultramarine, burnt sienna, ochre, crimson. The familiar scent of oil and turpentine filled her lungs, sharp and intoxicating. Madeline blinked, disoriented. She didn't remember laying out the palette, didn't remember washing the brush. She didn't even remember buying this particular canvas. It was larger than usual, nearly the size of her bedroom door. She took a step back. The silence was cavernous. Then a voice, soft, low, just behind her ear. "Begin." She turned sharply. No one. But when she looked at the canvas again, a faint outline had appeared. A sketch. A head and shoulders. A jawline. Her jawline. Madeline stumbled back, knocking over a stool. The crash echoed unnaturally loud. No, no, no! This wasn't possible. She reached for a rag, for thinner. Anything to wipe the outline away. But the sketch didn't smear. It didn't react at all. It was under the gesso, beneath the surface, like it had always been there. Her hands trembled. She stared at the painting, willing herself to turn around, to run, to scream, to destroy the thing, but her body wouldn't move. Only her hand. Slowly, inevitably, the brush dipped into the crimson, and the painting began. She watched in horror as her arm moved on its own, guided by something deeper than instinct. The strokes were sure, delicate. She painted her own cheekbone, the curve of her brow, the hollow beneath her throat. Tears streamed down her face, but her hand didn't stop. She was painting herself, not as she saw herself in the mirror, but as if from the outside, as if someone else was watching, capturing her from an impossible angle. She tried to speak, to cry out. Nothing. Her voice was gone. The crimson deepened into shadow. The eyes stared out at her, lifeless, empty. Madeline felt herself receding with every stroke, like her thoughts were getting quieter, further away. The room dimmed around the edges. Her limbs numbed. She wanted to stop. She wanted to stop. But the painting was nearly complete. With one final flick of the brush, her hand signed the corner. The signature trembled slightly, but it was hers. And then she dropped the brush. It hit the floor with a small clink, barely audible. She stood there for a moment longer, eyes locked with the painted ones. And then, darkness. A week later, the building was sold. The new tenant, a quiet man in his 60s, moved in without fanfare. He'd always wanted a studio to pursue his love of painting. The space was perfect. Large windows, high ceilings, that old wood smell he loved. While cleaning out the storage closet, he found a single canvas left behind, tucked in a wooden frame, leaning delicately against the wall. He almost didn't notice it at first. The portrait was striking. A woman seated at an easel, brush in hand, face caught in a strange expression, half fear, half peace. Her eyes were haunting, real. He turned it over, searching for a name. Nothing. Still, something about it pulled him in. That night, he set up the canvas on his new easel. Not to paint over it, no, he couldn't, it felt wrong. Instead, he stood and stared at it, for hours. And when he finally went to bed, the woman's painted eyes followed him into sleep. Just before dawn, he awoke with a strange urge to paint. He'd never been very good, but suddenly his hands felt confident, steady. In the silence of the empty studio, he reached for the brush and began.